How can he measure up to deserve affection, to ever be enough for this existence? When did it get so hard? Your heart is beating, alive and breathing, and there's a reason why. You are essential, not accidental, and you should realize you are beloved. Sometimes a heart can feel like a heavy weight. It pulls you under and you just fall away. Is anybody gonna hear you call? Oh, but there's a purpose under the surface, and you don't have to drown. Let me remind you that love will find you. Let it lift you out. You are beloved.
That's honestly today's message. And it's the message we're going to look at for the next few months. This idea that we're beloved. Can you let that soak in for a little bit? And just recognize that you come today extremely loved, just as you are. Because of who you are and because of whose you are, you're dearly loved. I'm just going to confess up front. I have this deal with God. I only preach if he gives me a message and the ability to share it. I have all the confidence in the world I have a message today. I don't have any confidence that I will share it. Just to be honest, I am so emotional today. Didn't even make it through the first 15 minutes of our study time without tearing up. But we have this deal, so I will try, and I hope that men in Texas can accept a man that still occasionally cries. But This is my inheritance. You can't tell, but it's my dad's fly rod. And literally, I think it's probably the only thing of any monetary value I really expect, which I'm fully at peace with that idea. I don't know that I'll ever fish with it, because when he tried to teach me how to fly fish, we were out in the gravel road in front of our house, and I would whip it one way and whip it back the other, and he said, "There goes a fly. There goes a fly. There goes another fly," because there's no possible way I had the patience or touch of a fly fisherman. Now, my dad taught me to fish, and some of my favorite memories are fishing with him, but I never did quite pick up on fly fishing. Maybe someday I will watch enough, I'll watch a river runs through it enough times to know how to do it. Or find a really good coach on YouTube, or somebody with the patience to help me do it. But this is my inheritance. But it's not just about the bamboo pole or the hardware or the flies that are hand-tied inside of it. My dad was a great fisherman. And I want to show you some of his greatest catches today. This is Garth. Garth is a cowboy and a forger. I don't mean like he's in prison for forgery. He makes knives. Matter of fact, if you go to the Black Hills, one of his kind of spare time things is that there's a place called the Fort where tourists will stop and eat cheap pancakes and then go around and see displays. And he's got a little forge set up and a little booth set up where he hand forges knives. And he's a hunter. One of my favorite pictures, and maybe if you like these kinds of things, I'll show you it later. But one of my favorite pictures is one of the mountain lions that he took down. Most people don't get upset when you kill a cat like that, like a big cat that's eating other animals in the neighborhood. So I figure that one's safe to talk about. But he's also a disciple, largely thanks to my dad. And he would say that. He texted me several times this week, and it was really cool. One of the texts talked about how he took one of Dad's closest friends, who's also having a hard time getting around. His wife is in a nursing home being cared for, and he's still trying to live it out in their home in the hills. But Garth went and picked him up, brought him in to see Dad. There's been a lot of that this week. Here's another great catch. This is Randy and Tabitha. And on the right side of the picture, there's 5 peregrines there. Now, farthest to the right is Randy, but next to him's his dad, Bob. Bob was an elder in the church I grew up at. And that's where Dad met Randy. He was an elder's kid, which sometimes can turn out to be like me and a preacher's kid. And don't get me wrong, all those men respected Bob, and Bob was a counselor. But next to Bob is Rex and Rocky. And the last one's Anthony, but I'm going to call him Rod because Anthony's Randy's son, but there's a son missing, and that was Rod, one of my good friends. But anyway, all of the Peregrine boys worked for my dad. Now, my dad quit a beautiful opportunity. He worked for National Cash Register when they first started out. He started in the Air Force, working for B-52s, donated his hearing to that. Maybe some of you can understand that. But when he got out, he really only had one life dream, and that was to live in the Black Hills of South Dakota. And that's what he did. He went up there and he just tried to find a way to make it work. He went to work for National Cash Register, which was really early in the computer scene. You think of them as cash registers, and every once in a while you'll still see an NCR label once in a while, but they were very early in the computer days, and I used to, every once in a while, get to ride with Dad in the hills, and he would go up and work on computers. Now, working on computers in that day meant going to a bank, because they were the only ones that could afford computers. And reprogramming a computer in that day involved pulling a giant card, about 4 foot by 4 by 4, I think, or 3 by 4, out from a slot. They called them punch cards. And then you would punch a hole. And each of those cards was 1 byte of information. You probably have more information in your watch, and that's a dumb watch, not a smart watch, computer-wise, than what this bank's computer would hold. But they would reprogram it, and he would literally punch these cards maybe once or twice a week, and that was what it took to reprogram a computer. Well, that industry changed very quickly, as you can imagine, as it still does today. And so it meant that he was traveling a ton to be in Ohio to learn all the latest and greatest things about reprogramming these cards or these machines, and it meant that he was away, and Mom was essentially raising 3 boys alone. And when he got close to his 40s, he realized he didn't like that. He liked it at first because it meant a lot of drinking and partying with the guys, and the first half of Dad's life was really about that, Then his kids met Jesus and reminded him about Jesus. Initially, we had some people that used to pick us up, take us to church. We were kind of smuggled in because Dad didn't want us to have anything to do with the church. He'd seen that, been down on that road as a kid. He didn't want anything to do with it. Then when Dad would travel, sometimes Mom would go with us and take us to church. And eventually, he found out, and church was making a big difference in his boy's life. My older brothers were hitting that teenage stage, and they're like, we need help with this. And I think I kind of remember when it happened, but I don't want to tell that story. There are very few public stories I can tell about my dad prior to him being 40 years old. I don't know if the statute of limitations has run out on all of them, So you got to be careful about those, but I'll just say he wasn't a great guy when he was younger, but he was a guy's guy, so to speak, right? He'd camp and fish and party, and every night after work they'd go drink, come home, his kids were in bed. And something happened that was a catalyst, and one day he ended up giving his life to Jesus, and he wasn't quite 40 years old when that happened. But when it did, Jesus started to change him. And like Bob and a guy by the name of Dennis were elders in our church, and they really helped my parents grow in their faith. But as Dad grew, he realized, I got to quit this job, and so he took up painting. He became a house painter, wanted to have his own business, set his own hours, and I think secretly just figured, hey, he had free labor with 3 boys growing up. That free labor would eventually cost him a lot, because some of us weren't very good at that. But these Paragon boys were good at it. And Dad took each one of them and mentored them, and that's what they all do. They're all in construction or building, but Randy especially, he saw something in my dad. He saw faith changing him, and he experienced it every day. And in the meantime, Dad was mentoring him and growing him in his business. Randy became like the son Dad kind of wished he had, somebody that would stick around and help him. But Jesus was doing something different in his boys' lives and making radical changes because we had seen what happened in Dad's life. And we wanted that. We were serious about that. So that's Randy and Tabby, and they're great leaders, and he was a great catch. This is Keith Hoffman. Keith is an elder at my home church now. But I remember Keith back in his before days, before Jesus was, like, he had this 65 Chevy Impala. I just remember that thing would get air over this certain section of railroad track until we broke the frame in half. Right? That was Keith, Keith's dad killed himself when he was little. My dad raised Keith practically. I mean, he and my oldest brother were just joined at the hip, did everything together. And now Heath takes care of my dad. Been bringing him communion for 2 years. Him and Dennis. Taking my mom and dad to doctor's appointments when my brother Lee isn't available. Keith was a soldier. He retired from the Army a few years ago. And my parents took care of his mom when she was struggling and when she passed. Keith was still in the Army and he wasn't home, And out of gratitude for that, Keith was just taking care of my parents. Such a good elder. He's a great hillbilly, too. He loves the hills. And pulled me out of a ditch or two, and I'd like to say it was when I was younger, but it wasn't that much younger. My kids were with me and my wife the last time he came and got us out of a road we shouldn't have been on. But Dad changed Keith. This is a guy I want to talk about is John. He's a cowboy. That's kind of a reoccurring theme amongst Dad's friends. He's a disciple and he's an elder in Prescott, Arizona now. John grew up on a farm in Minnesota, and he joined the Air Force, and he was early 20s when he joined the Air Force, like most kids. And Dad, he had spent his 4 years in the Air Force, and he bumped into John one day. Dad was twice his age. Dad was painting at an architectural firm in downtown Rapid City, and John had just moved into an apartment upstairs. And they literally bumped into each other in the hall. You want to talk about an intersection like we just got done talking about? Literally bumped into each other in the hall. And Dad just started up a conversation with John and said, hey, what you doing here? Oh, I just moving in, And Dad says, really? What are you moving here for? And John said, well, I'm in the Air Force. Dad, I was in the Air Force. What do you do in the Air Force? Well, actually, I don't remember John's job. But he was just getting ready to start his tour duty in Rapid City at Ellsworth. He had about 2 weeks before it started, and he didn't know a soul in town. And Dad said, well, why don't you come to dinner at our house tomorrow night? I got 3 boys at home, and my wife, she's a good cook. Why don't you come out to dinner tomorrow night? John, okay. Dad started to walk away, and he said, by the way, John, have you found a church yet? They hadn't talked about God. John said, no. And Dad said, well, maybe think about coming with me to ours. It's just a couple of blocks from your apartment here. I'd pick you up, or you can walk there either way. And John said, I'll do that. So he came to dinner. We had a good time at dinner that night. And then he showed up for church on Sunday. And the next week, we were leaving on a mission trip to Montana. We went up to this children's home in northern Montana. And Dad said, John, if you don't have anything going on, we're going to take this trip. You want to go with us? He figured out that he could get back in time to start work the next morning, his tour of duty. Been in town a day when Dad met him. Been together a week, so yeah, I'll go to Montana with you. And he went to Montana. And in Mission Lake, outside of St. Ignatius, Montana, my dad baptized him. In Mission Lake in May, you're still almost breaking ice off of it. But John was baptized on that trip. Came back and started his military career, but more importantly, his faith journey. My brother Lee was telling me this week that John was back last year, and he had the Bible my parents gave him. My dad had written him a note in the front cover. He still has that Bible, still carries it to church, leads Bible studies from it, does his elder duties from that Bible. And he turned back to the back page, and there was a period of time when my brother moved back and started doing ministry in Rapid City, and John happened to be there at that time still. And he had the last Bible study my brother ever led. He had the notes for that in the back of his Bible. And John just talked about what a difference my dad and Lee made in his faith. If I were to show you his Facebook page, it's filled with pictures because John's on their mission team. And he leads mission trips all the time with this group out of Prescott, Arizona. Take 40, 50 people and go to Mexico and do work at an orphanage. Or you can picture it. You have heroes like this in your life, the people that you love and appreciate that have invested in you over a period of time. I went on his church page and found a picture of him as an elder. This is what it says. I grew up on a farm in northwest Minnesota. Moved to Prescott in 2006 with my wife, Wendy, and we've been a blended family for 16 years. We have 2 daughters, 1 daughter-in-law, 1 son, and 1 son-in-law, as well as 6 grandkids, and I have experienced the power of God's faithfulness. At Quad City Christian Church, and have experienced the ways that He is growing our church. And I have a heart for making disciples in small groups, helping men become the husbands and fathers God designed them to be as they learn to trust and follow Jesus. I love John. I haven't seen him for decades. One of the great catches my dad had while he was fishing. We talk about one life at a time. That's what we've been talking about here, is how do we do this? This is how we do it. You might bump into him while you're at work in a hallway, like Dad did with John. Or you might bump into him here at church, like Dad did with Garth and Randy. The people around us need somebody to help lead them and teach them, somebody to help them follow Jesus. This is Mount Millermore. We grew up close to Mount Rushmore. You recognize that guy because he's wearing the same shirt today. My oldest brother, Lee, my dad, my brother, Rusty. These are officially the Miller men, right? But I got to tell you, Dad invested his life in the men of his church in a way that was exponential in growth. I'll tell you in the weeks to come about a guy by the name of Troy, about some other people. I'm sharing this with you because this is what's on my mind and what's in my heart. I'll be honest, I've never studied so hard for a message. I've taken multiple classes on John. John's theology has shaped my life. I went through and revisited several books, borrowed a couple of commentaries from Tom a couple of months ago and started reading through them and preparing for this series. And I just could not put it together in a way that flowed because this is what's on my heart. I want you to know the joy of bringing people to Jesus. and letting them know that they are deeply loved. And I don't care how old you are, you're not too old to do that. I don't care how young you are, you're not too young to do that. This passage from 1 John 2, verse 2, means a lot to me. It says, "Dear friends," or in other translations, "beloved, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known, but we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is." Actually, that's 1 John 3:2. That's a typo. I put the wrong chapter on there. It's right after the verse I opened with the call to worship today. You know, how great is the love the Father's lavished on us that we should be called the children of God. Dear friends, now we are children of God, and what we will be has not yet been made known. But we know that when Christ appears, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. One of the things I love about John is his perspective that he gives us on Jesus. Okay, so here's the teaching part of the day. He gives us a unique perspective on who Jesus is. So let's talk about John, the Gospel of John, the book. Here's the thing about the Gospel of John, the book. It tells John's story, but it tells it from his point of view, and it tells it with a very specific purpose. And so, I don't know if you know this, but do you realize that in the book of John, John's material, his story, is 90% original. Here's what I mean by that. Matthew, Mark, Luke, what we call the Synoptic Gospels, they all tell a lot of the same stories. As a matter of fact, about 60% of the material you can find in one, you can also find in another. Like their stories, it's even possible that maybe Luke had access to Mark, or that Matthew had access to Mark. You know, this whole synoptic problem, if you like to study things at a deep level, you know, there's a big question about, was there a cue? Was there a whole other source that Matthew, Mark, and Luke copied from? You know, which doesn't really change the authority or the, you know, how great the Gospels are. It's interesting theories. It's interesting things to think about, like where did they get their sources? Luke tells you, hey, I went out and interviewed people. I went and checked out with all the eyewitnesses. I've done my research, and here are the stories that I want to tell you about Jesus. Mark, he keeps everything super brief. Every story, it's just, he gets right to the point. He never would have made it as a preacher. Peter probably was the preacher that Mark gleaned most of his good material from, because they traveled together, and I think that's probably one of the best explanations for it. Matthew, he was writing to a Jewish group, and I mean, he's thorough, but he's thoroughly Jewish. So the people that are Jewish, the Jewish Christians, like, they loved his gospel because it gave his lineage and his heritage right up front. Mark doesn't do that. John doesn't care about that. You know? But Matthew, that was important to his readers, so he put it out there. John writes from a completely different perspective. John writes as an old man, for one. Most people, I don't know, most of the people I respect, I should put it that way, would say that this book was written, you know, somewhere short of 100 AD, somewhere around 90. Some people like to stretch that out to 120 or maybe 200 and give a credit to somebody other than the Apostle John in writing. You probably don't care about that. I'm just giving you my perspective. I think this was the apostle, and I'll give you a reason for that as we come. I think it was John, the apostle, the disciple, like the son of one of the sons of thunder that we read about in the gospel. I'll give you a reason for that as we go, but here's the bottom line, though. This book, in its structure and its purpose, is very intentional, as are the other Gospels. The other Gospels, like Matthew, he wants to help Jewish believers believe and strengthen their faith and recognize that Jesus was a complete Jew. He was Jewish, and he became a fulfilled Jew, and they could too, complete in Christ, the Messiah. Mark appeals to people that just want to get to the point, and probably more to a Greek audience. Luke, he's very thorough and also appeals to a Greek audience. John appeals to a Greek audience and a Jewish audience. We'll see that in the days to come. But the biggest thing is he has a purpose for writing. He's not just here to write a biography about Jesus. He wants us to respond to that biography. He wants us to respond to his narrative in a very specific way, which we'll get to in a moment. Here's a couple of things I just love about the book. One, it's very deep. Like, we're 25 minutes in, and we're in the introduction to this message. Don't worry, we're not going to go another 25 minutes. But at the same time, it's very accessible. You give a 7-year-old a copy of this book, and they can read it and understand it, basically, what it's about. John has a way to talking to kids and adults, to people who are brand new followers of Jesus, and people who have been around and around and around this story many times, and every time they're like, there's something new here. I love this book. Martin Luther says, basically, if you took all the rest of the Bible and lost it, and all you had was the Gospel of John and the letter to the Romans, you'd have everything you really needed to know about Jesus. Because John does such a good job in helping us see what happens. And Romans does such a good job of telling us why it all happened. It's a very deep, very accessible, very thorough book. The truth is, my theology has been shaped by by John's theology more than any other theology, and I think I love the book because I love John's story. His story from his perspective in it. If we were to work our way backwards, which we kind of are today, we would learn a few things about the author. The author, in John 21, we discover that this is the disciple that wrote this, and you can trust him. John 21:7 talks about how this is the disciple Jesus loved. He calls himself that. And he recognizes Jesus from the boat before any of the other disciples were. Remember, John 21, it's after the resurrection. Jesus is fixing fish on the beach. And the disciples are like, who is that? John recognizes Jesus. Peter takes off, jumps out of the boat, and runs after him. But John's like, I know who that is, the disciple whom Jesus loved. John never talks about himself as John in the book, by the way. He's always the disciple Jesus loved. In chapter 20, verse 3, he's the disciple that when the ladies come to the room and say, hey, Jesus is not in the tomb, Peter runs out and John races him to the tomb. The disciple whom Jesus loved, he refers to himself as there. In John chapter 19, when Jesus is on the cross, it's John, the disciple Jesus loved, that Jesus says, take care of my mom. He was Jesus's Keith. In John 14:22, the disciple Jesus loved leans into Jesus at Peter's request and says, ask him who it is that's going to betray him. John's sitting close enough to just lean into Jesus and ask him that question, and Jesus answers him. This is who writes this book, and here's what we see. In John chapter 20, we discover the passion that John has. After telling us the story about Thomas, which is one of my favorites, remember the disciples were in the room and Thomas wasn't there, which you scratch your head a little bit like, where was Thomas? Why wasn't he there? Because everybody else was there. They knew how important it was. John was there. They were at a loss. Their world was shaken. Jesus was crucified and buried. And where was he? The women came to the room. No Thomas there. But when he did come later and they tell him his story, remember how Thomas responded to it? No, I got to touch it. I got to put my finger in his wounds. I will not believe you. You're seeing something strange. But then Jesus appears again and says, okay, Thomas, touch. And he's like, I don't need that. because he'd been face to face with Jesus, and he wasn't ashamed of his doubt. Jesus didn't leave him lingering in his doubt. He faces up to that doubt. And then Jesus makes this comment about Thomas. Thomas, in verse 28 of chapter 20, says, "My Lord and my God," in response to seeing Jesus. And in the very next verse, Jesus says this about you and me. Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." That's us, the beloved, the believers. I haven't seen it yet, but I believe it. I have my doubts, but I believe it. I'm skeptical at times, but I still believe in this thing. And we start there, even though it's the end of the book. Actually, I think initially this was the end of the Gospel of John. John has an interesting thing. Like, it's got this prologue that we'll talk about next week, but then it has this epilogue, the story of the fish. I feel like, why does that add on? Because it sounds like the book was supposed to end here. Let me read verse 30 to you. Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Close the book. That's what he's saying. He's like, this is why I wrote all of these stories. I want you to have life in the name of Jesus. And I know that that only comes when you find belief that is strong and sure. And so I'm giving you all the signs. Matter of fact, he'll write about, they say 7 miracles, but actually, I kind of consider the prologue a miracle too, because one of the biggest miracles to me in all of eternity was in the beginning was God. And right there with it is in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God in the beginning. To me, that's pretty miraculous too, the incarnation of Jesus. But he puts these signs together. But don't miss the purpose of the book. The purpose of the book just comes out of the passion that John has as a pastor, and he was a pastor for a number of years. He was a disciple that became a leader of others, a caregiver for others. And what he wants more than anything else is for us to have the kind of life that comes from the kind of belief based on the signs that he's going to show us. Well, some of you are like, well, what do you think about chapter 21 then? What? If this is where the book was supposed to end, why do we have 21? Well, something interesting takes place here. There's a conversation that takes place in 21 between Jesus and Peter, right? The restoration of Peter to his thing. Peter, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? Of course I do. Of course I do. Of course I do. Feed my sheep, Peter, you know. And then Peter, having been given complete restoration and experiencing this just forgiveness and new vision for his life, somehow looks at John and says, well, what about him, Jesus? What are you going to do with him? And Jesus says this thing that I think the disciples maybe took the wrong way, which is why later either John or the church would clear it up with chapter 21. But he says, if I want him to live until I come back, what's that to you? And so when John dies, there's this thought that maybe chapter 21 gets added in to explain this mistaken belief that John would be alive until Jesus returned, because he dies as an old man, you know, but he still died. I think that's probably a pretty good explanation for it. The bottom line is it still belongs in the book. The church accepted it a long time ago. It's consistent. But what we get out of it is a second ending. This is what I think is cool. Go down to verse 23 of chapter 21. If I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? Verse 24. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true. See, I kind of think maybe somebody else wrote those words other than John. Because John's speaking about himself, like we know his testimony is true instead of my testimony is true. That's just my own thought on it. Either way, it's part of the Bible. It's part of the inspired word. Nobody really questions whether it belongs to be a part of this book at this point in time anymore. How it got there is maybe talked about. But look at how he closes it out then in verse 25. Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. John says, I could tell you so many stories about Jesus. Matter of fact, if we all just told our stories about Jesus, we'd never run out of opportunity and run out of stories to tell. There's just that many. But he says, the stories I'm going to tell you are going to lead you. They're going to be signs that point you to belief. And not just belief that, but belief in. What's the difference between belief that and belief in? I believe that chair would hold me. I think I could run from here and jump on it, probably break my leg, but the chair leg would hold. You obviously feel the same way because you're sitting in your chair, right? You trust it. You believe in that chair you're sitting in, or you wouldn't be sitting in it. I'm not going to run and jump on that chair. But for me to say I believe that chair would hold me is different than saying I believe I'll sit in this chair and it'll hold me. And I sit in it and it holds me. See, here's the thing. We want to have the kind of belief that trusts fully in who Jesus is and the life that he can bring us. And that's the purpose of this book. What matters most is for you to find real life in Jesus. What matters most is that real life can only be experienced through real faith. And that real faith is what John is going to point us to with the rest of the book. Here's what I'd like to encourage you to do this week. Read this book. It's 21 chapters. You could have it read before lunch and not even be that hungry. Or you could read 3 chapters a day. And when you do it, I'd like to encourage you to look for 4 words this week. Signs. Maybe circle those, or maybe draw a square like a sign around it. Belief, because we know this book's about belief. And here's the thing, you're going to find that there's a huge division that takes place in this book. There are people that believe and there are people that just do not believe. And there is controversy and conversation between those two groups of people. So maybe circle those times of belief when you see belief in your Bible, in this book. And then I want you to look for this word life, because that's what John wants us to discover. Maybe you star life or put a heart by it because it's life. And the last one I want you to look for is love, because you're going to find love on every page of this book. And that's actually my prayer for us today as we wrap up here today. God, I pray that as a church, we would identify with John, whose story is filled with your beloved Son. That you love the world so much, you gave your beloved Son, your begotten Son. Like at his baptism, you called him, this is my Son that I love, my beloved. God, would you lead us so that we see your beloved Son is your demonstration of love to us, your beloved children as well. And that by believing that, we might live a new life, changed forever. In Jesus' name, amen.